Welcome to the Gary DeMar blogcast. This audio is brought to you by Canon Press.
Today's article is titled, Privately Engaging, but Socially Irrelevant. We cannot live within the fluid boundaries of legal relativism. There must be a definitive and final legal standard of appeal to justify moral decisions at the personal and governmental levels. But by whose standard and by what standard? If there is no transcendental moral standard, then the opinion of one judge is as good or as bad as the opinion of another. The Ten Commandments have served as a fixed summary standard in the United States since before its official founding. As Nightline host Ted Koppel stated in a 1987 commencement address at Duke University, what Moses brought down from Mount Sinai were not the 10 suggestions. They are commandments, are, not were. The sheer brilliance of the Ten Commandments is that they codify in a handful of words acceptable human behavior, not just for then or now, but for all time. Language evolves, power shifts from one nation to another, messages are transmitted with the speed of light, man erases one frontier after another, and yet we and our behavior and the commandments governing that behavior remain the same. Now, one Christian website argues that since the Bible says every person is to be in subjection to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God, and those which exist are established by God, Romans 13:1, that Christians have no biblical right to oppose abortion clinics and legislation that normalizes homosexuality and transgenderism as civil rights issues. Why? Because the claim is made that we are in the dispensation of grace. Here's how some in the anti-law crowd argue. These pastors are trying to turn unsaved pagans into righteous heathen instead of presenting them with the gospel as Paul did. Now, does this mean that passing laws against murder, theft, and perjury should not be imposed on pagans? The Bible is clear that the law was made for those who are lawless and rebellious. Is Paul only describing lawless and rebellious Christians? I don't believe so. He lists murderers, homosexuals, kidnappers, liars, perjurers, and whatever else is contrary to sound teaching. 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 9 and 10. What type of world would we be living in if these laws did not apply to everyone? One has to wonder how such an argument would apply to unsaved pagans and the slave trade, man-stealing, and kidnapping, a law that is actually found in the Old Testament that would have stopped the slave trade in the United States and the Western world, and gas ovens. What do we do in the meantime while they're witnessing to the likes of a Hitler, a Stalin, and the people at Planned Parenthood and the politicians who support and fund them? If Christians serve politically, what standard do they apply to the civil sphere? Should Christians even participate politically? If they do, is it a violation of Romans 13 to oppose the funding of immoral and unconstitutional programs like legalizing and funding abortion, homosexual marriage, the welfare state, wars, government education? Must we wait until all these legislators become Christians? William Wilberforce didn't think so. Beginning in 1789, Wilberforce frequently introduced bills in Parliament to ban the slave trade, and he repeatedly was voted down by a large margin. But he pressed on. In March of 1807, the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act abolished the practice in the British colonies with overwhelming support. Slavery itself was not abolished until 1833. A Christian worldview was operating at the time, even though many of those who opposed slavery were not professing Christians. There are numerous Christians who believe that only a personal, private faith is all the gospel requires. Os Guinness describes this belief as the private zoo factor in his book, The Gravedigger File. It's a religion that is caged so that it loses its wildness, and that's what's happened to much of Christianity today. When true Christianity is applied to any part of the world, it blossoms far more fully than any other worldview. When pagans stopped believing they lived in an enchanted forest and that glens and groves, rocks and streams are alive with spirits, sprites, demons, and nature teems with sun gods, river goddesses, and astral deities. At that moment, their world and everything in it changed. Everything seemed possible within the boundaries of God's providence and law. The Christian worldview made science possible and civil government ministerial rather than messianic. Stanley Yaki, the author of numerous books on the relationship between Christianity and science, made the following comments. Nothing irks the secular world so much as a hint, let alone a scholarly demonstration, that supernatural revelation, as registered in the Bible, is germane to science. Yet biblical revelation is not only germane to science, it made the only viable birth of science possible. That birth took place in a once Christian West. Over time, Christianity ceased to be a comprehensive, world-changing religion. Where religion still survives in the modern world, Os Guinness writes, no matter how passionate or committed the individual may be, it amounts to little more than a private preference, a spare time hobby, a leisure pursuit. Theodore Roszak used an apt phrase to describe much of modern-day Christendom. Socially irrelevant, even if privately engaging. Now, keep in mind, it wasn't always this way. The Bible, both the Old Testament and the New Testament, comes out of the background of a Hebrew mindset. C. Peter Wagner writes. The basic idea behind the Hebrew mindset is that God and accompanying spiritual principles permeate all of life here on earth. I believe, he writes, one of the causes of cultural disintegration is a Greek mindset, which tells us Christians should be concerned about saving souls and going to heaven rather than paying attention to material things like transforming our societies. James Davidson Hunter, to the contrary, says, most Christians in history have interpreted the creation mandate in Genesis as a mandate to change the world. So then, as long as Christianity remained nearly exclusively privately engaging, the secularists have no interest in disturbing the sleeping giant.